Thank you for watching 30 Minutes. I'm your host, Daniel Lefkowitz. Today we have a very interesting panel, experts on wildlife, and today's topic is going to be living with coyotes and other wild animals in Yorktown. This is going to be an informational program, and my guests today are Kevin Clark, Region 3 DEC wildlife biologist, Fred Kuntz, PhD, who is the Executive Director of Teatown Lake Reservation, and James Waterhouse, who is the Animal Control Officer for the town of Yorktown. I'd like to thank you for coming on. So why don't we start with Fred? Just tell me about yourself.
Well, I'm the Executive Director at Teatown Lake Reservation. I'm sure many Yorktown residents and Northern Westchester residents know us as an environmental center that's really devoted to saving nature in the lower Hudson Valley. We give it the term the Hudson Hills and Highlands. The center itself is an 834-acre nature preserve with 15 miles of trails, and we see about 18,000 children and adults a year in our educational programs.
Well,
Kevin?
I'm one of many wildlife biologists across the state that New York State DEC has. I'm stationed in New Paltz, which is our headquarters for Region 3. I am both the deer and fur bearer biologist. I've been doing it for about 3 years now, and I'm getting used to dealing with situations like what we have a lot of in Yorktown, these human-animal conflicts, and see what we can figure out today and inform the public about.
Terrific. James?
I am the Animal Control Officer for the town of Yorktown. I work out of the Yorktown Police Department, basically dealing with domestic pet issues, but also public safety issues and/or sick or injured wildlife animals here in the town of Yorktown.
Well, today we're going to focus on coyotes. We're hearing a lot more incidents about coyotes being found in Yorktown, even being found down in Van Cortlandt Park, and before we mentioned about Central Park.
Central Park, yeah.
So let's discuss, what is a coyote?
Coyotes are a member of the canid family, which encompasses dogs, red foxes, wolves. They're what we call a medium-sized predator. They average about 30 to 40 pounds. They're a species that originally occurred out in the west in the Plains states and have encroached eastward from there. And also they believe that they've come down from the north from Canada as well. And mostly solitary animals, although we do see some family groups and some pack-oriented activity in New York State. But they're what we call one of those top predators, top of the food chain animals.
And here in Yorktown, in Northern Westchester, they're relatively a newcomer. We probably, in New York State, first saw coyotes around 1940, or right after World War II maybe. And then the Hudson Valley, maybe in the late 60s. But they really didn't get down to Northern Westchester until 1975 or 80. And most residents in the area really didn't start noticing them until probably the last 5 or 6 years. But they're on the increase.
Now, where did they originate from?
Well, at the time of the European settlement, as Kevin said, they really were a mid-country animal living in the prairies. And then at the late 1800s, they started going west and northwest. Some biologists think that they actually followed the early miners as they moved towards the California Gold Rush, for example. But at the turn of this last century, 1900s, they started moving eastward. So again, they didn't arrive to New York to about 1940, and they've been ever since.
So how does one tell whether, if there's a coyote in the backyard, how would they tell the difference between a coyote from a fox or even from a small dog?
Well, what I would say is if you see sort of a German Shepherd-sized dog, but it doesn't quite look like a dog, like you might notice that its tail is extra long and bushy and held straight down, whereas most domestic dogs will hold the tail either level or even up a bit. It may well be a coyote, whereas a fox is much smaller. That's more like a small-sized dog. It has more of a pointed nose. Of course, it's red. It has a long, bushy tail also, and there's a white tip on the tail. So a small dog that isn't a dog, but looks a little cat-like, might be a red fox, whereas the coyote is really German Shepherd size. It might weigh 40 pounds around here.
Yeah, size is a pretty good indicator. Most red foxes will average anywhere between 10 and 15 pounds, and a coyote from 30 to 40 pounds, like I said earlier. So, I mean, size is a pretty good indication. A lot of domestic dogs, domestic breeds are much bigger than coyotes, but you will have some domestics that are around that same size and look similar, smaller German Shepherds and whatnot, and the color patterns are very similar. So it can be confusing at times.
And the colors, they come in?
They'll more gray, brown, reddish, those colors combined. Occasionally you'll see a black coyote. I've only seen one in my life, but we've gotten reports, and I believe Fred mentioned that they had a black coyote over at T-Town recently.
Yes, and sometimes they have a bit of white underside of them also. But you can also tell a difference between a coyote and a dog by its behavior. You know, being a coyote is a difficult life. You don't have time to relax. You're out really moving, and coyotes they're busy working. They'll move in straight lines, for example. They're serious. They're businesslike. Whereas a domestic dog is wandering around and sniffing things and moving around more almost randomly. So if you see a serious-looking dog the size of a German Shepherd with a bushy tail that's straight down, you may well have seen one of these coyotes that's living in the area.
How many coyotes are there in New York?
I'd say the last estimate that I heard was about 50,000. But how many we have in the lower southeastern portion of New York would be difficult to estimate. Coyotes recently in the last 10 years have been increasing in the southeast, and we don't really have any good population estimates as of yet, but somewhere around 50,000 statewide would be a pretty decent estimate.
James, how many coyotes have you seen in Yorktown?
A good amount, probably about 20. Can't tell if they were, some of them were the same, just seen over, the course of time. But I have seen anything from the pups to the full-grown adults and the pups with the adults. Unfortunately, sometimes they do take up residence in people's yards. So it's things that people need to be mindful of.
At T-Town, we did a photographic study where we put out what are called camera traps. And these are automated cameras that when a mammal moves past them, it takes their picture. And we did this over a year period, 40,000 hours of observations with 100 sample sites. We did record 36 pictures out of 1,500, 3% coyotes. But the size of T-Town is about a square mile. And we determined that there were probably 2 pairs of coyotes living there with their pups. So I would guess, one thing that we know, there's a lot more wild animals, including coyotes, than most of the time we realize. Coyotes are not looking to seek people out, just the opposite. And so my own guess is that in Yorktown, which is about 40 square miles, there's probably closer to 50 to 100 coyotes, based on what we discovered at T-Town.
Do they travel down we have the power lines going through Yorktown, through Westchester. Do they follow that path?
Yeah, I would agree that they probably would. We have some research going on in Westchester right now by a gentleman out of Cornell University, and one of the things that he's found is that green spaces like power lines are frequent corridors that coyotes will travel, and that's where a lot of these sightings come from, is coyotes traveling along these corridors that are adjacent to people's backyards. So while they're traveling, they're very opportunistic animals, and they'll feed along the edges of these wood lots and green spaces where people's yards butt up against them.
In T-Town, and in Yorktown and northern Westchester, we have a lot of forest. And coyotes really are not forest animals. Matter of fact, they used to be called the prairie wolf. They're really more of a shrubland kind of animal. So at T-Town, when we did this photographic study, we found that we happen to have a power line that goes right through T-Town, and sure enough, the coyotes preferred the power line, which is a shrub area, and we also have a farm at T-Town with fields, and they preferred that area. And finally, so shrubland, grassland, and at T-Town, hardwood swamps, but they do predate on deer. They predate on raccoons, for example, and all kinds of small mammals. But here's something that probably a lot of our residents don't know. They also eat more plant material than you might think.
Yeah.
They don't just eat meat. They're carnivores,